Hello. Hasn't been, it's been a while since I was back, which is sort of a sad indictment on the amount of free time I get. We are perilously behind on getting to the end of Good Omens by the end of the month, so we're probably going to go into June and not be ready by May 31st, but that's fine. That's fine. So I wish I could promise that these are going to come out every day, but I think it's become clear that that's not going to happen. But I hope you still enjoy it. And let's get going with Section 6. Sometimes he was called White, or Blank, or Albus, or Chalky, or Weiss, or Snowy, or any one of 100 other names. His skin was pale, his hair a faded blonde, his eyes light grey. He was somewhere in his 20s at a casual glance, and a casual glance was all anyone ever gave him. He was almost entirely unmemorable. Unlike his two colleagues, he could never settle down in any one job for very long. He had had all manner of interesting jobs in lots of interesting places. He'd worked at the Chernobyl power station, and at Windscale, and at 3 Mile Island, always in minor jobs that weren't very important. He had been a minor but valued member of a number of scientific research establishments. He'd helped to design the petrol engine, and plastics, and the ring-pull can. He could turn his hand to anything. Nobody really noticed him. He was unobtrusive. His presence was cumulative. If you thought about it carefully, you could figure out he had to have been doing something, but he had to have been somewhere. Maybe he even spoke to you, but he was easy to forget, was Mr. White. At this time he was working as deckhand on an oil tanker heading toward Tokyo. The captain was drunk in his cabin. The first mate was at the head. The second mate was in the galley. That was pretty much it for the crew. The ship was almost completely automated. There wasn't much a person could do. However, if a person just happened to press the emergency cargo release switch on the bridge, the automatic systems would take care of releasing huge quantities of black sludge into the sea, millions of tons of crude oil, with devastating effects on the birds, fish, vegetation, animals, and humans of the region. Of course, there were dozens of fail-safe interlocks and foolproof safety backups, but what the hell? There always were. Afterwards, there was a huge amount of argument as to exactly whose fault it was. In the end, it was left unresolved. The blame was apportioned equally. Neither the captain, the first mate, nor the second mate ever worked again. For some reason, nobody gave much of a thought to Seaman White, who was already halfway to Indonesia, on a tramp steamer piled high with rusting metal barrels of a particularly toxic weed killer. And there was another. He was in the square at Kumbola Land. He was in the restaurants. And he was in the fish and in the air and in the barrels of weed killer. He was on the roads and in the houses and in palaces and in hovels. There was nowhere that he was a stranger. And there was no getting away from him. He was doing what he did best. And what he was doing was what he was. He was not waiting. He was working. Harriet Dowling returned home with her baby, which, on the advice of Sister Faith Prolix, who was more persuasive than Sister Mary, and with the telephonic agreement of her husband, she had named Warlock. The cultural attaché returned home a week later and pronounced the baby the spit of his side of the family. He also had his secretary advertise in The Lady for a nanny. Crowley had seen Mary Poppins on television one Christmas. Indeed, behind the scenes, Crowley had had a hand in most television, although it was on the invention of the game show that he truly prided himself. He toyed with the idea of a hurricane as an effective and incredibly stylish way of disposing of the queue of nannies that would certainly form, or possibly stack up in a holding pattern outside the cultural attaché's Regent's Park residence. He contented himself with a wildcat tube strike, and when the day came, only one nanny turned up. She wore a knit tweed suit and discreet pearl earrings. Something about her might have said nanny, but it said it in an undertone of the sort employed by British butlers and in a certain type of American film. It also coughed discreetly and muttered that she could well be the sort of nanny who advertises unspecified but vague but strangely explicit services in certain magazines. Her flat shoes crunched up the gravel drive, and a grey dog padded silently by her side, white flecks of saliva dripping from its jaws. Its eyes glinted scarlet, and it glanced from side to side hungrily. She reached the heavy wooden door, smiled to herself, a brief satisfied flicker, and rang the bell. It donged gloomily. The door was opened by a butler, as they say, of the old school. Footnote. A night school just off the Tottenham Court Road, run by an elderly actor who had played butlers and gentlemen's gentlemen in films and television and on the stage since the 1920s. "I am Nanny Ashtoreth," she told him, "and this," she continued, while the grey dog at her side eyed the butler carefully, working out, perhaps, where it would bury the bones, "is Rover." She left the dog in the garden and passed her interview with flying colours, and Mrs. Dowling led the nanny to her new charge. She smiled unpleasantly. "What a delightful child," she said. "He'll be wanting a little tricycle soon." By one of those coincidences, another new member of the staff arrived that same afternoon. He was the gardener, and as it turned out, he was amazingly good at his job. No one quite worked out why this should be the case, since he never seemed to pick up a shovel, and made no effort to rid the garden of the sudden flocks of birds that filled it and settled all over him at every opportunity. He just sat in the shade while around him the residents' gardens bloomed and bloomed. Warlock used to come down to see him when he was old enough to toddle, and Nanny was doing whatever it was she did on her afternoons off. This here's Brother Slug," the gardener would tell him, "and this tiny little critter is Sister Potato Weevil. Remember, Warlock, as you walk your way through the highways and byways of life's rich and fulsome path, you have to have love and reverence for all living things." "Nanny says that living things is fit only to be ground under my heels, Mr. Francis," said little Warlock, stroking Brother Slug, and then wiping his hand conscientiously on his Kermit the Frog overall. "You don't listen to that woman," Francis would say. "You listen to me." At night, Nanny Ashtoreth sang nursery rhymes to Warlock. "Oh, the grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill and crushed all the nations of the world and brought them under the rule of Satan our master." And "This little piggy went to Hades. This little piggy stayed home. This little piggy ate raw and steaming human flesh. This little piggy violated virgins. And this little piggy clambered over a heap of dead bodies to get to the top." "Brother Francis, the gardener, says I must selflessly practice virtue and love all living things," said Warlock. "You don't listen to that man, darling," the nanny would whisper as she tucked him into his little bed. "You listen to me." And so it went. The arrangement worked perfectly. A no-score win. Nanny Ashtoreth bought the child a little tricycle, but could never persuade him to ride it inside the house, and he was scared of Rover. In the background, Crowley and Aziraphale met on the tops of buses and in art galleries and at concerts, compared notes, and smiled. When Warlock was 6, his nanny left, taking Rover with her. The gardener handed in his resignation on the same day. Neither of them left with quite the same spring in their step with which they'd arrived. Warlock now found himself being educated by 2 tutors. Mr. Harrison taught him about Attila the Hun, Vlad Dracul, and the darkness intrinsicate in the human spirit. Footnote. He avoided mentioning that Attila was nice to his mother, or that Vlad Dracul was punctilious about saying his prayers every day. He tried to teach Warlock how to make rabble-rousing political speeches to sway the hearts and minds of multitudes. Mr. Cortese taught him about Florence Nightingale. Footnote. Except for the bits about syphilis. Abraham Lincoln, and the appreciation of art. He tried to teach him about free will, self-denial, and doing unto others as you would wish them to do to you. They both read to the child extensively from the book of Revelation. Despite their best efforts, Warlock showed a regrettable tendency to be good at math. Neither of his tutors was entirely satisfied with his progress. When Warlock was 10, he liked baseball. He liked plastic toys that transformed into other plastic toys, indistinguishable from the first set of plastic toys, except to the trained eye. He liked his stamp collection, he liked banana-flavoured bubblegum, he liked comics and cartoons, and his BMX bike. Crowley was troubled. They were in the cafeteria of the British Museum, another refuge for all weary foot soldiers of the Cold War. At the table to their left, two ramrod-straight Americans in suits were surreptitiously handing over a briefcase full of deniable dollars to a small dark woman in sunglasses. At the table on their right, the deputy head of MI7 and the local KGB section officer argued over who got to keep the receipt for the tea and buns. Crowley finally said what he had not even dared to think for the last decade. "If you ask me," Crowley said to his counterpart, "he's too bloody normal." Aziraphale popped another deviled egg into his mouth and washed it down with coffee. He dabbed his lips with a paper napkin. "It's my good influence," he beamed, "or rather, credit where credit's due, that of my little team." Crowley shook his head. "I'm taking that into account. Look, by now he should be trying to warp the world around him to his own desires, shaping it to his own image, that kind of stuff. Well, not actually trying. He'll do it without even knowing it. Have you seen any evidence of that happening? Well, no, but by now he should be a powerhouse of raw force. Is he? Well, not as far as I've noticed, but he's too normal." Crowley drummed his fingers on the table. "I don't like it. There's something wrong. I just can't put my finger on it." Aziraphale helped himself to Crowley's slice of angel cake. "Well, he's a growing boy. And of course, there's been the heavenly influence in his life." Crowley sighed. "I just hope he'll know how to cope with the hellhound, that's all." Aziraphale raised an eyebrow. "Hellhound?" "On his 11th birthday, I received a message from the hell last night. The message had come during The Golden Girls, one of Crowley's favourite television programmes. Rose had taken 10 minutes to deliver what could have been quite a brief communication, and by the time non-infernal service was restored, Crowley had quite lost the thread of the plot. They're sending him a hellhound to pad by his side and guard him from all harm. Biggest one they've got. Won't people remark on the sudden appearance of a huge black dog? His parents, for a start." Crowley stood up suddenly, treading on the foot of the Bulgarian cultural attaché, who was talking animatedly to the keeper of Her Majesty's antiques. "Nobody's going to notice anything out of the ordinary. It's reality, Angel, and young Warlock can do what he wants to that, whether he knows it or not." When does it turn up, then? This dog? Does it have a name?" "I told you, on his 11th birthday, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It'll sort of home in on him. He's supposed to name it himself. It's very important that he names it himself. It gives it its purpose. It'll be killer or terror or stalks by night, I expect." "Are you going to be there?" asked the angel, nonchalantly. "Wouldn't miss it for the worlds," said Crowley. "I do hope there's nothing too wrong with the child. We'll see how he reacts to the dog anyway. That should tell us something. I hope he'll send it back, or be frightened of it. If he does name it, we've lost. He'll have all his powers, and Armageddon is just around the corner." "I think," said Aziraphale, sipping his wine, which had just ceased to be the slightly vinegary Beaujolais, and had become a quite acceptable, but rather surprised, Chateau Lafite, 1875. "I think I'll see you there." Okay. And that's all for now. Hopefully, I will see you again soon. Till then.